Thanks, everybody. We're here for the database sharding working group, and I actually thought it'd be a good time to recap where we were from last meeting and actually probably the last couple weeks. There's been a lot of important developments and clarifications that have happened over that last period. So I'll run through them real quick, and feel free to interrupt if I'm going too fast or if we need some clarification on something. So on the scalability standpoint from Jerry last time, and from the linked issue that's in there, we are highly confident that we won't run into a wall in the next 12 months. When the working group first started, we thought the wall was much closer and we had a critical scalability issue, but it seems as though that's been pushed back to 12 months. And that does not mean at month 13 we are going to hit a wall. And this is a metric we're going to reevaluate every month. So next point, so concerns about partitioning by time on audit events has been alleviated. It's not something that will block us if we choose a different partitioning or sharding strategy. It's if they are in conflict, it's a migration event. So if we need to repartition audit events on namespace, if that's possible, then we would just migrate from the time partitioning to a namespace partitioning, and the time that takes to do that work is the only hit it will take. We can reuse the migration tools that we've created for audit events for the new partitioning strategy if that should happen, but it's not a blocker. They are not in competition with each other.
I would rather just say that instead of repartitioning, which that may involve data migration, what it's probably the best option is to just use two-level sharding. So one strategy, higher level for namespace, lower level, keep it all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
I think my question there was, what I was trying to get at in that comment, Craig, was I agree that would be, if I can do that, would be ideal. But whether we would hit the partition limit on Postgres, depending on how granular we went with the time-based partitioning.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad we're having the recap. So all valid comments and concerns, and they're not all recapped here. This concern came from Sid, that he thought that going down this was orthogonal to the overall strategy of namespace partitioning. And the reason we talked about this last week was to allay those concerns for Sid, that this would not stop us from namespace partitioning, and that, to Alvaro's point, we could have both. I'm sorry, namespace sharding, we could have both. We could still namespace shard, and then on the individual shards, we could still partition by this strategy as well. And yes, Josh, that was another concern about the number of partitions that were created, and those questions are answered deep in some of the related issues within the audit events partitioning epic. So I think we're okay with the number of partitions that we've identified. We're looking at 96, and the question becomes around 100 or 200 if you're starting to hit a point where you're going to hit some performance problems. So those questions have been answered within the epic itself. But yes, all valid concerns and points when talking about audit event partitioning. Any other topics on that one? All right, so the tenant sharding discussion, Sid requested a meeting to talk further about details on that. I believe it was originally scheduled for today, but that got pushed back to the 22nd. In the meantime, I think there's probably a couple of conversations that we should have, Andrew, Josh, and whoever else wants to be involved, to kind of hammer out some of the details and maybe get some ideas on what an MVC first iteration would look like for that, so we can compare to some of the research that's already been done on namespace sharding and some of the changes that we would need to make, because there are entries in the handbook on the database section about what changes would need to take place if we did namespace sharding on issues, what application changes would need to take place, what would also need to take place in the database. So making sure that both the development part and the product changes are covered. I think we should probably have a couple syncs on that before we meet up with Sid on June 22nd, and I will own setting those up.
Probably sooner the better, so we can have some time to some lead time on that.
Yep, I will set those up right after this meeting. All right, any questions on that? Cool. There's some parallel work going mostly on the database team right now to improve scalability. These are, I keep calling them incremental. They'll get us, probably, I don't know, NX, not the 100X overhead improvements, but it will get us some improvements on database scalability side. Right now, the main focus is partitioning of audit events. Pretty optimistic that we can have the database implementation in production next week, or I'm sorry, next milestone. And what that looks like is we would still have the original table, which the application is functioning on, but we would also have the partition tables alongside, and they would continue to be populated as new rows come in, but we would be able to test performance side by side in the production database. We would not have any application changes yet because we still need to talk with product about what that would look like on the front end. So an example, setting up a date picker to optimize and make sure that it's always using the created at partition key so that we get the best performance and that we kind of steer user behavior towards the optimal path on the partitioning keys. Because if we're going by created at, it's going to be monthly. If you, as an example, if you pick the last 7 days, there's a pretty good chance you're going to span 2 different partitions, which isn't terrible, but we're going to try and drive behavior more towards the optimistic path on date pickers, or at least that's what we're talking with product management about. So the TLDR tables will be in the production database. We'll be able to test side by side, just using console instead of actually going through the application. And if you take a look at the Epic, we are making sure that the health status represents where we are for the milestone on all these. So we're on track for pretty much everything we have for 13.1. This one specific issue about partition audit events table, that's kind of just a summary of the work that's being done. I did not author this issue. I would actually probably recommend closing it, but I think other teams are using that to track. So we'll circle back on that one, but making good progress on partitioning audit events for now. And then there are some other incremental scalability improvements that we have listed under database growth, and the Epic is listed under the MR. There are a bunch of changes that I've added to the MR for this handbook entry for this working group. I would recommend going and taking a look and sending me some feedback. One thing that I recommend is we change the name of this working group from database sharding to sharding. The focus is no longer just on the database side. There are some significant application changes that need to be made. Need to make sure that product management is fully involved on making sure those application changes are accounted for, and we might have to get some more dedicated development teams on this as well. Any questions on that?
I just put a note in there, happy to review it. I started to try to glance at it, Craig, but you may want to push me on it this week to make sure we can review it and get it merged.
Okay.
Makes sense to me.
Yep. There was a lot of information that changed in there.
Yeah,
so.
like the name change makes sense to me, I should say. I need to look through the rest of the details, exit criteria and stuff I saw was changing, so I want to just make sure I understand that.
Yeah, and I fixed Josh's title in there. I think he's listed as the Geo product manager as well. So lots of things changed. All right, and then I kind of covered what we're talking about for partitioning on the database team side. These are all in support of getting the partition tables into a testable state. And then benchmarking. So actually finishing up the migration, benchmarking are up next. Any questions, comments? We did a lot of talking.
One thing I might want to mention here, Josh, if the MRS merged to rename the working group to Sharding working group, from the product perspective, shall we combine this with what Jeremy person is driving of the model, the business model of the application. Should these two topics combine? I mean, join?
You mean the tenant sharding proposal?
Yeah, tenant sharding proposal. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm not aware of a separate effort around like that, but I do think, depending on maybe the outcome of the meeting with Sid on the tenant charting, that Jeremy should potentially be involved there. But also, if we decide to go forward with that, we should probably make sure Jeremy gets invited here, as he sort of is the product manager for that area. Does that help answer your question, or am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, that answers my question, because I think they're tightly related. Probably not exactly the same, but the idea is very much aligned. I mean, having the tenant or customer as some sort of a model.
Yeah, well, I think sorry, I just replay. So if we go namespace, the application user experience doesn't really change, right? Like it's the same functions, it's the same look and feel. It's kind of the multi-tenant experience where you can span groups, you can span the stuff. Like, that's all the same, right? And so I think.
So
sorry,
Josh, when you say if we go namespace, are you talking about namespace sharding?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay.
Right.
Not necessarily true. There will be some product decisions that need to be made, and I can link you back to the handbook entry where Andreas did an example of searching by issues. So if there's some product decisions that he calls out in there, like it'll work just fine if we narrow the scope of search to the namespace that the user is in, or and depending on the functionality within GitLab. But if you look at like the issue board for a user, that will most likely break if we go with namespace sharding, because the issue board, they can look at every namespace a user's involved in, and then the query would have to span all of those shards. So there will be some product changes that would need to happen.
Got it. Okay, but yeah, but I think, at a high level, it's not going to change dramatically as far as how the workflows work within GitLab, right? The runners can still be across, or no, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a blanket statement on how much of an impact of a change there would be. I think you'd have to go feature by feature, which we started to do in, I always call it issue 50, because
I guess we're getting too much detail into there.
Okay,
but
so if we're going to the tenant model, that's going to basically have a more isolated experience for tenants in GitLab and get away from the GitHub model, which is sort of where it's all, it's all kind of one big common area, right? And shifting more towards, say, the Slack model, then Jeremy should be involved, I would think, because he owns this product area as far as the managed product manager, right? Which is isolation, and he's already driving features in this area, like group managed accounts and things like that. I think we are pulling him in on the tenant discussion. So,
what's Jeremy's last name again? Josh?
Watson.
Okay.
Yeah, my main suggestion here is just to try to align our what we are doing here. I mean, if we go with tenant sharding, it doesn't break what Jeremy Watson is designing from the feature or the business level. So
I think it makes it irrelevant, right? Like we'd essentially throw it away. I think Jeremy is trying to develop isolation without taking the full step of a tenant model, right? And so if you tenant model, then you have no need for group managed accounts, because accounts by definition are isolated to a tenant. And so all these features you don't have to build anymore.
It sounds like there's some pretty good overlap there. I mean, we have the goals for this working group for scalability and customer isolation. So getting Jeremy involved makes sense, and the details of how he will be involved will clarify as we figure out namespace versus tenant. So I'll make sure he's involved.
I agree that in principle, something like namespace sharding may require some application changes, but just due to the optimizations needed when some queries that are going to hit several shards need to be performed, but not necessarily from a change or reduction in functionality. Even if the user's word is going to be shown, you can either throw the query through the coordinator paying some latency penalty, or you can do that query manually in parallel to all the shards from the application side, yet still you can keep the same functionality. Maybe a hidden performance may need some work, but in theory, from a general perspective, it may remain with the current functionality, whereas the other model, it is quite simpler, I would say, to implement, but it requires some changing on the product functionality. So that I think is the balance. But theoretically, again, the sharding by namespace model may not require to change user perceived functionality.
Yeah, agreed. I think there's going to be a discussion with product on how much work we want to do to make that either seamless or make changes to be more optimistic for the partition sharding model that we choose. So.
Yeah, that's what I get to. If this is more about database sharding and it's not going to impact the broader user experience significantly, then I'm not sure Jeremy really minds too much. But if we're going to go to the tenant isolation model, or if we're going to make dramatic changes to just isolation in general, he should definitely be involved. So.
Okay. See, we have some questions. Can you collaborate? Yep. So I've got that follow-up item, Sean, to your concern. I'll schedule some follow-up discussions, or if they need to be async, however they manifest, I'll make sure they happen. Christopher, you had a question?
Yeah, it was more of thanks for putting the table together, and it kind of listed out that the MR request diff files table is the largest table, but like based on the proposal, it's going to be much smaller, basically an order of magnitude change, which to me is a 30 times multiplier. So like I looked at that and was excited about that. I guess the question was when I looked at the issue, it looked like it had some activity 10 months ago and then had some activity 2 months ago. And I just wondered, do we need to push for that to get prioritized?
Actually, Alberto and I were just talking about that. So in the background, the external storage was happening, but something happened recently to cause it to break, and it was incredibly slow. I think we were looking at multiple months before this was completed. So I haven't looked since Alberto and I talked about this late last week. So it is ongoing, and there might need to be a gentle nudge to make sure that it started back up if it has not continued. Does anybody know if that migration has resumed?
Isn't it just strictly an infrastructure issue to work it, or is there an application change?
The last time I looked at it, there were definitely application problems that needed to be resolved, but that was the last time I looked at it. There was problems with transactions that were being opened for like 10 minutes, and there was data corruption. So I don't know where that is. But I think on the infrastructure, pardon me,
there was a code bug that was blocking it. So let me find it and post it there.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, it's still in the engineering development court.
So
the other, sorry, Craig, just one other point. I think the other thing we got to discuss with that is it's gonna, if you look at the rate at which it's moving over to, it's just really, really slow. And so even if we fix all the bugs, we can't have this thing taking 2 years or even a year to do this migration. And so we need to have a discussion around that as well at some stage, just to raise that up as a point.
Okay, thanks for pointing out that it was blocked by something. Looks like the block thing got closed in 12:10. So hopefully that's unblocked it from that perspective. But if that hasn't, then let's figure out what the next thing is so we can fix that too. And that's a good point, that we had to figure out how to migrate it more quickly. Thanks for that information, Andrew.
I mean, who's the DRI for running that migration? Because it kind of feels like we've just sort of decided that it's actually an infrastructures core, but I don't know who's driving this. So, I mean, that's sort of outside the scope of this working group, but I don't know who it is, but someone should be running this. It feels like it's kind of not owned by anyone.
Yeah, that's a fair characterization. Let me put that on my schedule to talk to Steve about that, kind of like from that perspective. The reason why I said infrastructure is because I just saw the namespace for infrastructure. So then I just was like, okay, you know, that's my first, like, short of someone telling me, that's my first indicator for which group is responsible.
Yeah, and it could well be, but it just kind of feels like, you know, we need someone kind of driving it.
Yeah, we need. That's why that was just my question: is do we need to push on prioritization? And it sounds like the answer is yes, Christopher. By the way, you need to address the confusion around it, and that's good feedback. Appreciate it.
So, and to address your point earlier, Christopher, about you know, shrinking this table gives us 30x overhead. Yes and no. So yes on database storage, but no on the overall picture, right? Because it doesn't include like CPU, memory, IO, all the other things that we consider when we're looking at scalability. So it is one improvement, but not the big, you know, the overall big picture. So
yeah, that's good. 30% on storage. It was just more of like, you know, like when we have, I won't call it low hanging fruit, but when we have these kinds of optimizations, it feels like we should be also making sure those are. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and along those lines, like the top 3 tables take up well over 70% of our database storage, and that is covered under the database growth epic that we have. Just looking into retention strategies, how we can shrink that, how we can make it more manageable. So all considerations we're looking at. And then Mac, I'm gonna verbalize your question.
Yeah, sure, thanks. Yeah, it's along the same lines what Christopher's asking. The due dates on the working group is August 11th. Do we think that this is reasonable, or do you think that needs to be adjusted given the change in approach?
I don't know. I would hope by then we have settled on, like, the big questions now are namespace versus tenant. Which approach are we going to take, and having some goals set by then. I'm not confident we would have something delivered by then. So yeah, we should probably consider changing it or clarifying the goals that we have. You know, we've chosen a strategy, we have an MVC identified, and first implementation by a certain date, and inform that with data from those decisions. So yes, the date is very questionable. Thank you.
Thanks. Intention is not to get the answer to the next date, but let's look out for it. Lower that capacity overall. Thanks.
All right, we are at the end of comments and questions. Anything else we need to cover today? All right, we'll take that as a no. Thanks, everybody.